Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first members-only film club of 2021. My name is Alicia Dixon, and I'm the Development Associate with Film at Lincoln Center. Tonight, we are joined by FLC Assistant Programmer Dan Sullivan and special guest, film critic and author of Bridge of Light, Yiddish film Between Two Worlds, Jay Hoberman. Before we get the conversation started, I want to remind you all that tickets are now on sale for the New York African Film Festival. Members of Film at Lincoln Center receive 20% off when they enter the appropriate promo code, which can be found on our member corner. And additionally, if you have any questions for tonight's speakers, please utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Finally, I want to thank you all for your continued support of Film at Lincoln Center, and thank you to the members of the Jewish Museum for joining us for this event. As a reminder, memberships start just at $85 a year. So I hope you'll all consider joining today for year-round benefits, ticket discounts, and much more. Please visit filmlink.org or email members@filmlink.org to become a member. And now I will turn it over to Dan and Jay Hoberman. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Alicia. Yeah, it's with great enthusiasm and so on that I'm here with Jay Hoberman tonight to talk about this Edgar G. Ulmer film that hopefully you all have seen, The Light Ahead, also known as Fishke the Lame. So I was thinking, just to sort of kick things off, I feel like we have to establish a few different kinds of context, I think, for the film. So I wanted to first talk about like the very phenomenon of Yiddish cinema, which of course seems like this very sort of singular, striking thing to us now. But Jim, of course, has written a whole book on it, so he seems like the guy to ask. So first, I just wanted to sort of talk a bit about about Yiddish cinema, and maybe a little bit about how like the production and distribution of American-made Yiddish films would have proceeded at the time, because like this was shot in New Jersey, I believe. Yeah. So it's like outside, it's like away from the Hollywood system, but still notably like in America. So, and there's of course there's like these various points of intersection with the world of Jewish or of Yiddish theater. So Jim, I guess I was hoping we could just start by sort of sketching out a little bit how like production distribution might have worked for Yiddish cinema. I know, like in an interview I read years ago, Ken Jacobs talked about like on a Saturday afternoon seeing a Yiddish film than a Western, and that seems really remarkable. So yeah, could you illustrate this a bit?
Sure. Well, a couple of things. You could describe Yiddish cinema as a national film without a nation state. And there were other examples of this, actually, although none as developed, as extensive as Yiddish talkies, in part because there was a large international audience for them. But in the United States, there were the race films, all black movies that went into production in the teens and continued into the 1950s. So that was probably the largest of the ethnic film industries. Yiddish talkies started in 1930, right after sound came in. However, there's a precursor to them. There are what you could call silent Yiddish films. These were films that were made with casts drawn from the Yiddish theater, made primarily for Jewish audiences. They were made in Poland. In fact, they were made in Poland before there was a free Poland, when it was still part of the Russian Empire, in Austria, in the Soviet Union, and in the United States. So there's a whole prehistory to Yiddish films, and they were distributed as small silent films would be. I mean, they tended to cross borders because of the subject matter. When sound came in, everything became much more complicated. I mean, in a way, the audience was more self-selected because it was primarily a Yiddish-speaking audience, although there was a large Yiddish-speaking audience in Poland, as well as the United States, and in other countries as well. And sound films were just more expensive to make. They were just more problematic. So you tended to have a series of independent films by fly-by-night companies that would often go broke. It was very much connected to Yiddish theater, which was kind of in its heyday and going into decline as a mass form in New York in the 1930s. So there was very that was close by, you know, I mean, it's each Yiddish film is a story all its own, in a sense. Each production had its own degree of tsuris, let's say, its own complications. They were very inexpensively made. I mean, Edgar G. Ulmer, who made the Light Ahead, is one of the two major auteurs of Yiddish talkies, and he actually had been in Hollywood by way of the German film industry, and then got exiled from Hollywood, and then he made some Ukrainian language films also in New Jersey. In fact, he used the same sets for his Yiddish films and his Ukrainian films. I mean, another way to look at these movies, at least the American ones, is they're the precursors of independent cinema, both the race films, the Yiddish films, the Ukrainian language films. There was a couple of Armenian language films. There even were some films that were made in Neapolitan dialect in New York, because Mussolini had, you know, forbidden dialect in Italian movies and so on. So they were independent movies. You know, most ethnic groups had countries that were producing films. I mean, you know, if you came from Latin America, there were theaters that showed nothing but Mexican and films from Argentina. You know, but there were you know, there were theaters that showed Polish language films and so on. So that's the world in which Yiddish films, you know, blossomed while they did blossom.
Yeah, and then you know, another, yeah, I think a very important sort of piece of context here as well is just Ulmer, like Edgar G. Ulmer as a figure, and I think this film falls within what I think Noah Eisenberg is called his ethnic intermezzo, but it's this kind of it's this like pivotal point between some of the early Hollywood films, like you know, The Black Cat is like 5 years before this, and then of course he goes back to Hollywood, but he makes, like you said, he made a Ukrainian musical. Two. He made an all black musical. Has Parliament. Yeah. So it's a very, very interesting period in his career, but he's just like an interesting figure. Period. Maybe could you tell us a bit about sort of like Ulmer and like how his kind of like exile position maybe kind of enters into this film?
Yeah, well, Ulmer had a Jewish background. I don't think he came from a particularly observant family, but he came from a Jewish family, and he grew up largely in Vienna, which had a substantial East European Jewish population then. So he knew something about this. However, he didn't set out to make Yiddish films. In fact, I should say parenthetically that there's a whole tradition of actors in the Yiddish stage who learned Yiddish to act. You know, just as if there were a number of writers who were originally writing in Russian or Hebrew who switched to Yiddish because there was an audience there. And so Ulmer came to New York. I think he was, when he left Hollywood, and it's very romantic. I mean, his wife had been married to somebody else. I don't know.
It's Lemley, I think.
Lemley's nephew.
Yeah.
It's sort of like he got expelled. He got blacklisted for love. I mean, it's so he made a movie in Canada. I think it was a sort of a scare film about gonorrhea or syphilis, and then he came to New York sort of looking for work, and he was hired by, I can't remember the name of the Ukrainian impresario, who was resembled the African-American filmmaker Oscar Micheaux, in that he sold tickets for a movie that he hadn't yet made. He was very popular with Ukrainian audiences. He was a dance master. He used to tour all around the United States, the Western United States. Canada also had a lot of Ukrainian immigrants, and they would buy tickets for this movie that he would say, well, he'll bring it back in a year. You know, Micheaux did something like that also. And so somehow Ulmer, you know, who was kind of an all-round guy. I mean, he started as a set designer, so he knew, and, you know, camera operator. I mean, he really could produce a movie in a fairly artisanal way. Having made this Ukrainian film, he was then approached by people who wanted to make a version of the Peretz Hirschbein play Greenfields, which Ulmer made on an insanely low budget in New Jersey. You know, kind of an open air, creating a sort of open air shtetl, very pastoral, and, you know, a lovely play. I mean, which had been sort of a part of the Yiddish art theater, you know, movement and so on, and it was enormously successful in Jewish neighborhoods in New York. And this is, you know, when I was writing the book, I would track through the Yiddish press. I would track the distribution of these movies, and these movies, they would play up and down the Bronx, Southern Boulevard. I mean, every theater in Southern Boulevard. I'm not surprised that Ken saw them with the Hopalong Cassidy westerns, because, you know, they were showing Greenfield. You know, and it's like second or third release was being paired with, you know, Shirley Temple films and stuff. It was just very, very, you know, popular. Ulmer didn't speak Yiddish, but, you know, German was his language, so he certainly understood it. I'm sure he heard a lot of it, but he had somebody on set always, you know, who was much more fluent in Yiddish. You know, another Yiddish-speaking actor to help with the direct the actors. Although I'm told that he directed in German, but, you know, or broken English, I don't know. I mean, but he always had a guy. In fact, the guy who plays Mendele in The Light Ahead was kind of his co-director in this film, and Ulmer handled everything else.
He was the guy who's credited as the co-director of Greenfields, maybe.
Well, the guy who's the co-director in Greenfields is actually Jacob Ben Ab, who was distinguished Yiddish actor, you know, and I mean, it's very funny, you know, with Greenfields. He had played the part of the young yeshiva student when he was a young man in the original in Greenfields, and he wanted to play it again, but he was like probably 50 years old by this time, and Ulmer kind of pulled a fast one on him, supposedly. This is according to the guy who actually did play it. I don't know. You know, when I was doing the book, one of the great privileges of doing this was I got to speak to a lot of the you know, surviving veterans of Yiddish movies. And so supposedly Ulmer sort of roped Ben Ami and said, "Oh, I have a special camera that'll make you look younger," and so on. Anyway, suffice to say that it was Michael Goldstein who got the part, and Ben Ami was there, you know, coaching.
Yeah, if I could chip in like a couple more sort of Ulmer points that just kind of I think are like pertinent to this film or interesting is just kind of like this is the same year this film comes out, the same year that his native Austria is annexed by the Nazis, so that considering some of the symbolic kind of readings of the film, I think that seems like that's quite interesting. And then also you brought up the his like a gonorrhea film or something like that, but he made like short documentaries for the National Tuberculosis, which kind of the National Tuberculosis and Health Association, which kind of like confers this kind of interesting significance on the place of cholera in the narrative of this film a little bit.
Oh yeah. No, that's it. Yeah, that's significant. Also, the guy who wrote the screenplay, a Yiddish writer whose nom de plume was Avra Pavra, was suffered from tuberculosis himself and was quite sick while the film was in production. So I think that both of these things. First of all, I mean, the whole cast was hyper aware of what was going on in Europe. I mean, they virtually all of them either were from Eastern Europe, from Poland, or still had family there. And in any case, the Yiddish press reported on these things extensively. So at the end, when Mendele makes that speech in close-up, sort of in direct address to the audience, I mean, everybody who was in the theater knew what he was talking about, and that this danger was overwhelming. And the movie came out right, after the Germans and the Soviets invaded Poland. So it was happening. It was happening.
You earlier you mentioned Ulmer's background in set design, production design, and that of course is very very relevant to this film. I think it's probably a rendering of the shtetl that's quite unlike many others, I guess. I saw this attributed to The Voice, but I don't know if you said this or not. Is calling it the shtetl of Dr. Caligari? Was that?
Oh, wasn't me. I mean, what I said in the book, when I said it in Bridge of Light, was I said it was like a sort of a confluence of I said it's its most expressionist Yiddish film. Yeah. Also, it resembles the sets that Marc Chagall made for the Moscow State Yiddish Theater and so on. There is a kind of Jewish expressionism, that already existed and that he's tapping into. But yeah, I mean, it definitely has this Caligari-esque quality.
Yeah, no, it's just it's very interesting. It also kind of in a way, it seems to function to kind of connect the then modern plight of Jews to something kind of older in a way. But in any event, I was wondering about, I think a lot of the writing that's out there about the film, maybe not Bridge of Light so much, but it there's that people sort of take the sort of cholera motif in the narrative and a host of other things that happen in the film. It's this kind of like a parable that's connecting the plight of Jews in the world in 1939 to this late 19th century 19th century sort of Eastern European Jewish experience. I don't know.
I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to ask what you kind of make of this, people framing the film as a parable.
I don't know. I mean, I think that the film has a lot of components. I mean, more than that. Although, it's not surprising that people would read that into it. But he was making a kind of, it's one of the few shtetl films, at least the American shtetl films, that has a kind of a negative view. I mean, it's really a movie about Jewish underdevelopment. I mean, they you know, it's an impoverished place. It's unsanitary. You know, it's a kind of theocracy. You know, they won't allow a hospital to be built. You know, there's an internal war going on in the shtetl there, and I think that reflected the point of view of the filmmakers. I mean, it's a left-wing movie, both in its ideology and its casting and production and everything, which I could go into in greater detail if anybody's interested. But whereas I think that the question of Jewish vulnerability, specifically East European Jewish vulnerability, is omnipresent in the movie. What it's also getting at is a you know, a sort of reactionary force in Jewish life that this movie opposes. It's all for modernization, and you know, and this was the point. You know, it's taken from the stories by Mendele Mokher Sforim, who was a late 19th century Yiddish writer, sometimes called the grandfather of Yiddish literature, who was very like. I mean, the sources for this are far more anti-clerical than the movie. Also, the movie was cut. You know, but there's like nearly half an hour that's taken out of the movie, and you know, again, I can tell you what I think is missing and so on, which even reinforces this kind of war in the town between the you know, the modernizing Jews and the traditional Jews. And I think it's Mendel himself says, somebody says, better a Jew without a beard than a beard without a Jew, or something like that. I mean, that tells you, you know, something of what was going on. You know, so I mean, that's also part of it. I mean, that's certainly something that the audience would have picked up on. I don't know that they needed a movie to warn them what was about to happen in Europe. I mean, you know, Hitler, you know, came to power. It had been in power for 6 years already. In fact, you know, the first anti-Nazi movie was a Yiddish talkie, which ran in. This is in 1933, before even the movie that Herman Mankiewicz wanted to make, and it ran into trouble with you know, movies had to go foreign. It was considered a foreign movie, even though it was made in the United States, and the censors had a lot of problems with it because it was you know, it was an out and out anti-Nazi film. So that's all I would say to that. So to me, that's a reading of the movie.
Yeah, I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions for Jim, or less likely for me, feel free to type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom, and we'll try to answer those before we wrap this up. I want to talk about the kind of romantic, you know, the romantic theme in the film, the sort of star-crossed lovers thing that I think was there are a slew of films kind of from that general era that kind of you know, fit that bill, and it seems striking to me. I think Ulmer worked on Sunrise. No, I think he was like a.
So he says, yeah.
That's what he said.
Worked with Murnau.
Yeah, because I thought that was the one that was more likely to be confirmed than, like, because I think he also said he worked on sets for the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Yes, he would have had to have been like 13 years old.
Yeah. But anyway, it just, like, it struck me in watching this that it would actually probably make for a really interesting double bill with Sunrise, because it's almost like it's almost like a pre-sun, a pre-sunrise. Like they don't go to this, they don't go to city until the end. You don't see it.
No, and the city is good.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's they're escaping they're escaping the countryside into the city.
Yeah. So what do you kind of make of the just, I guess, of the connection there between these kind of like kindred films? Like, what do you think it's kind of, what about people's like anxiety about modernity or so on do you think is coming through?
Well, if you're going back to the central conflict in Yiddish cinema, as was true of Yiddish theater, especially in its American iteration, was generational. It was between parents and children. And that's where the real, it wasn't, so much between men and women, and it wasn't, romantic entanglements. And you don't really have that here because they're both orphans. These, they don't have parents, who they can rebel against and then come back contritely to, which is the pattern often in popular Yiddish theater. That the parents, the older generation, is generally sorry, my screen just acted up. I don't think.
Oh, it happens.
Yeah, it happens. I know. All right, hopefully we'll be good for a while before it comes back. So what was I saying? Yeah, I mean, I think that as Yiddish talkies go, this is not the only love story, but it's a particularly poignant one. And I think that there's a subtext in the acting here, in that David Apatashu, who's quite young. I mean, actually, they both are. Helen Beverly. They're both very young, and he was involved with the Artef, with the Jewish Workers Theater. Was a friend of Jules Dassin and so on. His father was a well-known Yiddish writer, and she also did some acting with them. Anyway, she was a younger generation. They were more Stanislavskian. I mean, they were more subtle in their acting, whereas Isidore Kashir and the other ones, a lot of them came from Maurice Schwartz's Yiddish art theater. It's a sort of hyper theatrical, very emphatic, kind of old-fashioned style, which was very popular on the stage. Audiences loved it, but it doesn't work as well in the movies. So there's this odd, setup in the movie where this ostracized couple, who are on the fringe of society, are actually not just, they're the most modern in their affect too. And also, they're just extraordinarily, they're both, beautiful performers. And, so there's, that adds something to the story as well.
Yeah. I know we'll open up some of the audience questions, so we don't run out of time. I'll start with my esteemed colleague from the Jewish Museum, Aviva Weintraub, would like to hear about the scenes in the film that were cut in a more, I guess, can we go into some of the excise material?
Okay, starting from the end, the wedding sequence, which in the cemetery was a bit longer. They made it abrupt. A real shame, I think, because that looks like it's going to be a great scene, a great sequence, and that was directly working against the cliche in Yiddish theater and cinema that ending with a wedding. Aside from that, much more is made of the whole Galaganska chicken thing. It's never really made clear. I mean, unless you're familiar with the source and so on, what's going on there. It's a scam, which was not unheard of, even in New York, of like of creating a sort of syndicate, for kosher meat, and then the price would go up, and they wouldn't. That's why he wants to get his chicken from another town because it's cheaper. But they say no, it's not kosher in that town. So there's that, and that there's a scene evidently in the mikveh where they continue this discussion of it, and also there's much more debate on on building the hospital. And maybe this was something that Ulmer, was particularly interested in. I don't know. I mean, the public health aspects of the movie may have been something that he was particularly drawn to. So that's basically what's gone. But it's a good 25 minutes, and you can see that it all these things added to not just to the length, but to the weight of the movie.
Yeah. And we have a question. It's about a film you mentioned in passing. This audience member is wondering what was the title of the Yiddish first anti-Nazi film.
The English title is The Wandering Jew. And coincidentally, it starred Jacob Ben-Ami, the younger Jacob Ben-Ami. It came out in 1933, 34, maybe. And when I interviewed him in 1975, this movie was lost. It was rediscovered by the National Center for Jewish Film maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but it was lost for a long time. And I asked him about it. He told me he never heard of it. He never made this movie. I mean, it was like, I learned not to be surprised at, in interviews with that kind of answer. But it's not a great movie, but it's quite blunt for what it is. And I think that the National Center has it. I know it was shown in some years ago. I think it had its premiere in the Jewish Film Festival, New York Jewish Film Festival.
And then I don't think we have any other audience questions. I'll maybe ask a question on the audience's behalf, which is for everyone who perhaps hadn't seen a film in Yiddish or distinctly sort of like Yiddish film of this period before. Where would you steer them next after this? I mean.
After this, well, there's a, the classic one is the Polish version of the Dybbuk. And there's also Maury Schwartz's version of Tevye, which came out the same year. And those are the two blockbusters, I would say. And then there's a raft of other interesting ones. Certainly, all of Ulmer's films. He made 3 other Yiddish language films that they're all worth seeing. I particularly like The Singing Blacksmith, Yankel Schmid, which has this cantor star, Moshe Oisher. And but his other films, I mean, Greenfelder, and a lot of people like American Matchmaker, Americana Shotgun. It's funny, sort of like a crazy kind of like sort of a Stair Rogers movie without Ginger Rogers, and Leo Fuchs kind of was in the Astaire role. That was his last one. So there were those. I mean, Joseph Green made Mitten Fiddle. That's a delightful musical with Molly Pecan, and he made another movie with her called Mamala, and 2 other movies which are in Poland. All of these are in Poland, which are interesting. And then there's some other Polish films which are kind of harder to see that are good. And then there are a lot of silent films, particularly the Soviet silent films are really worthwhile. And those had a fun. I mean, the whole industry was very pragmatic. There were a number of silent films that in the 1930s would be dubbed into Yiddish and then shown, of course, at the wrong speed in Jewish neighborhoods. But it's, a lot of them, still exist in their original form. So I don't know, there's a lot. should get my book though.
Yeah. Actually, this for some reason, what you were just saying reminded me. I saw earlier today. I saw the poster for Greenfields, and they were pointing to the fact that the film would have like English subtitles as like a major selling. Like, you're never going to believe this. It's like,
Yeah. Well, it's fortunate that the National Center for Jewish Film and other entities have been re-subtitling these movies, because the original subtitles were very cursory, and also, of course, a lot of the humor was lost. That's thus recapitulating a famous story about Jewish households where your parents or your relatives would be telling a joke, and then suddenly they deliver the punchline. They lapse into Yiddish for the punchline. So lapse into Yiddish for other things they didn't want kids to understand.
From my youth, I know the phenomenon.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we can probably leave it there, unless there's anything you want to add before we call it.
No, I would just like to thank people, for coming out to see, for I guess streaming the movie, and thank Lisa and Sharon at the National Center for Jewish Film for doing a restored version of it, making that available. And, it's these films have been around for a long time, and somehow people are always surprised when they when they turn up, so that's a phenomenon in itself.
Yeah, I wonder if it's a function of just kind of what happened with the Ulmer's career later on, like it's kind of like a in-between moment maybe, or something like that. But everyone should buy Bridge of Light and all of Jim's other books, because they're all they should be on your shelf if they're not already. And thank my colleagues at Film at Lincoln Center. Oh, there it is. That's what it looks like. Right on. All right. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
Okay.
Everyone who's watching.
Yeah.
All right.